Five teens kicked over a war veteran's meal at a highway diner, laughing like they were untouchable. What they didn't know was that the quiet man in the corner booth had spent 30 years learning how to end fights before they started. If that sent a chill down your spine, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind you why you never judge a book by its cover. The Silver Spoon Diner sat just off Route 9, the kind of place where truckers stopped for pie and locals came for the meatloaf. It had checkered floors worn soft by decades of boots and sneakers, wooden booths with names scratched into them by people who wanted to leave a mark somewhere in the world. Patty, the owner, had run the place for 22 years. She knew every regular by name and kept photos of their kids on the wall behind the register. The coffee was strong, the portions were generous, and on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, it felt like the safest, warmest spot on earth. Stephen sat alone in the corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl seat nobody else ever chose. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but unhurried, wearing a simple gray jacket and dark jeans. His dark hair had silver running through it now, thick at the temples. He had a cup of black coffee and a plate of eggs he hadn't touched yet. He was reading a folded newspaper, old habit from years when phones weren't an option. To anyone walking in, he looked like a retired mechanic or maybe a retired teacher, someone's quiet uncle, someone who'd seen enough of the world to stop needing to announce himself in it. Patty refilled his coffee without asking, the way she did for people she liked. He thanked her with a nod and a small smile. A trucker 2 booths over was on the phone with his wife, laughing about something their daughter had done at school. An elderly man named Harold sat at the counter eating soup, his hearing aid slightly too loud, the spoon clinking the bowl in a steady rhythm. Near the window, a young mother was cutting up a sandwich for her little boy, who kept making his action figure fly over the salt shaker. Then the door burst open. 5 teenagers spilled in loud and fast, the kind of loud that doesn't ask permission. They wore matching athletic gear, black and gold, their school's colors, the kind of kids who walked in packs and fed off each other's energy. The tallest one had a jaw like a brick and moved like he owned every room he walked into. His name was Bryce, and everyone at their school knew it. He was the kind of boy who'd been told he was special so many times he'd started believing the world owed him something. The others orbited around him like he was the sun, laughing at whatever he said, doing whatever he did. They pushed into a booth near the center of the diner, not asking if it was available, even though a woman had just left her jacket there while she was in the restroom. They shoved the jacket to the floor without a word. Patty came over with menus, her voice patient and professional. The boys barely looked at her. Bryce leaned back in the booth, his arms stretched wide across the top, his eyes scanning the diner like he was deciding what he thought of it. Not great, his face said, not worth his time. They ordered without saying please. One of them, a wiry kid with a buzz cut, snapped his fingers to get Patty's attention when she started walking away. She turned, and he pointed at his menu without speaking, like she was supposed to read his mind. Patty just nodded and headed back behind the counter, her jaw tight. At the counter, Harold was slowly finishing his soup. His hands shook a little, the way older hands do, but his eyes were warm and sharp. He'd lived in this town for 60 years. He came to the Silver Spoon 3 times a week. Patty always saved his spot. Bryce noticed him. You could see the moment it happened. Bryce leaned over to one of his friends and said something low, and they all started laughing. Harold didn't look up. He just kept eating his soup, one careful spoonful at a time. Bryce slid out of the booth. He walked slowly, the way people do when they want you to know they're not in a hurry, when they want to feel powerful in the movement itself. He stood just behind Harold, and in a voice loud enough for the whole diner to hear, he said, "Hey, old-timer, you know soup's not gonna help at this point, right? Some things are just too far gone." His friends laughed. The trucker looked up from his phone. The young mother pulled her son a little closer. Harold set his spoon down. He didn't look at Bryce. He just sat there quietly, like he was deciding whether the moment was worth responding to. Bryce wasn't done. He reached out, casual as if he were brushing a leaf off a table, and knocked Harold's bowl. The soup splashed across the counter, splattered the old man's sleeve, soaked into the front of his shirt. Hot soup, not scalding, but enough. Harold flinched, more from the shock of it than the heat, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, his eyes wide. The diner went silent. Not the kind of silence where nobody has anything to say, the kind of silence where everyone has something to say, but the air has been sucked out of the room too fast to say it. Patty appeared from the back with a cloth, her face pale and tight. The trucker stood halfway up from his seat. The young mother covered her son's eyes without thinking. Bryce laughed. His friends laughed with him, though two of them looked at the floor instead of at Harold, which meant they still had enough of a conscience to feel something, but not enough courage to show it. Harold turned slowly on his stool to face Bryce. His voice was soft, the kind of soft that's not weakness, just age and dignity. He said, "Son, I'm gonna ask you one time to please walk away." Bryce tilted his head, playing it up for his audience. "Or what, old man? What exactly is going to happen?" From the corner booth, a newspaper folded. Nobody heard it happen. They just noticed it, the way you notice the wind change before a storm. The man with the silver-streaked hair set his paper down flat on the table. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, set it back down. Then he stood up. He didn't stand up the way angry people stand up, fast and loud, knocking things over, making a scene. He stood up the way people stand up who have stood up in difficult moments so many times that it's just a motion now, just something their body knows how to do. He walked towards the counter, not rushing, his steps steady on the worn, checkered floor. Bryce turned to look, his grin still going. He looked the man over once, top to bottom, the way teenagers sometimes do when they're deciding if someone is worth their attention. Gray jacket, dark jeans, silver in his hair. Looked like nobody in particular. "You need something?" Bryce said. The man stopped a few feet away. He looked at Harold first, a quick look that said, "Are you all right?" And Harold gave a small nod back. Then the man looked at Bryce with a calm so complete it made the teenager's grin wobble. "You just poured a bowl of soup on an old man," the man said. His voice was low and even, like someone reading a weather report. "You're going to apologize, and you're going to clean that up." Bryce blinked. Then he laughed, but it came out a little hollow. He turned to his friends for backup, and they gave it to him, a chorus of jeers and eye rolls. The buzz-cut kid said, "Who is this guy?" One of the others, a stocky kid with a red face and restless hands, stepped forward. He pointed at the man's chest. "You better back up, old man. You have no idea who you're talking to. Bryce's dad owns half this town. You walk away now, and maybe nothing happens to you." The man looked at the finger being pointed at him, not with anger, but something more like mild curiosity, the way you look at a fly that's landed somewhere inconvenient. "Move your finger," he said quietly. The stocky kid, whose name was Derek and who had never actually been in a real fight in his life, was not prepared for how completely unbothered this man seemed. Derek's finger wavered. Patty had moved to the phone behind the counter, but she'd stopped dialing, watching. Bryce stepped closer. He was taller than the man by 2 or 3 inches, broad with the physical confidence of someone who'd always been the biggest in the room. He said, "Last chance, man. Walk back to your little corner and eat your eggs and pretend this isn't happening. That's the smart move." The man tilted his head slightly. "You kicked an old man's soup over to make yourself feel big," he said. His voice still hadn't changed, still completely level. "That's not confidence, that's fear. You're afraid of everything quiet, everything decent, because it makes you feel small, so you knock it over." The diner was so still you could hear the little boy near the window whisper, "Mama," to his mother. Bryce's face changed. The grin was gone now. Something harder and uglier took its place. He shoved the man in the chest, hard, 2 hands, the kind of shove meant to send a message. The man didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He absorbed it, weight shifting back just slightly, like a tree in wind. He looked down at where Bryce's hands had been, then back up at Bryce's face. "That's the last time," he said. Bryce pulled his arm back and swung. What happened next lasted about 4 seconds, but it is the kind of 4 seconds people remember for the rest of their lives. The man moved his head just enough, barely an inch, and the fist passed his ear like a missed train. Bryce's momentum pulled him forward, and the man stepped aside, one smooth step, and guided Bryce's arm downward, so the bigger boy's own weight bent him almost double. From that angle, off balance and confused, Bryce had nothing. The man held him there for a moment, forearm across the back, completely in control, not hurting him, just showing him with absolute clarity that the situation had changed. He released Bryce and stepped back. Bryce straightened up, his chest heaving, his eyes wild, the way eyes get when the brain is trying to process something it wasn't ready for. He spun around and threw another punch, faster this time, angrier. The man slipped it again, same quiet economy of movement, nothing wasted, nothing dramatic, just clean and precise and utterly calm. He caught Bryce's wrist, turned it slightly, and Bryce found himself stumbling into the counter, catching himself with both hands. The stocky kid, Derek, rushed forward. The man turned, saw him coming, and did something that looked almost gentle. He stepped into Derek's charge instead of away from it, put one hand on his shoulder, and redirected his momentum sideways, so Derek skidded across the checkered floor and sat down hard against the base of a booth. He wasn't hurt. He was just suddenly sitting on the floor looking up at the ceiling lights, trying to figure out what had happened. The other 3 stood frozen. Bryce came again, angrier than before, which made him sloppier. The man caught the swing, held Bryce's arm locked, and looked him dead in the eyes from about 6 inches away. He said nothing. He just held him there, perfectly still, completely unafraid, while Bryce breathed hard and realized with cold certainty that he could not move. The man released him again and stepped back. "You're done," the man said, not loud, not triumphant, just a fact. Bryce stood there, chest heaving, his hands at his sides. Something had gone out of it, the performance of it, the show. What was left underneath was just a 17-year-old who had badly miscalculated something. One of the 5, a quieter kid with glasses who had looked uncomfortable since the moment they walked in, backed towards the door. Another followed, then the buzz-cut kid, then Derek getting up off the floor slowly, not making eye contact with anyone. Bryce stepped alone. He looked at Harold at the counter. He looked at Patty behind it. He looked at the man standing calm and still in the middle of the diner. Then he walked to the door and pushed it open. He didn't run. He still had that much pride left. But his shoulders were low and his steps were quiet, and the gold confidence he'd walked in with was gone, like steam off a wet street. The door swung shut. The little bell above it rang once. Harold let out a long, slow breath. His hands were shaking a little more now from the adrenaline, but his face was calm, the face of a man who had been through hard things in his life and survived them all. He looked at the man in the gray jacket and said simply, "Thank you." The man walked to the paper towel dispenser, pulled off a long sheet, and handed it to Harold without making it a big deal. Then he turned to Patty. "Can we get him a fresh bowl? My bill." Patty stared at him for just a moment. Then she nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, and when she came back, her eyes were a little wet, which she covered by being very businesslike about setting down a clean bowl in front of Harold. The trucker sat back down. The young mother let her son go back to flying his action figure over the salt shaker. The diner exhaled. The man walked back to his corner booth, sat down, picked up his newspaper, and unfolded it. He was on the third paragraph when Patty came over and stood at the edge of the table. She said quietly, "I've seen your movies. I didn't want to say anything earlier because I didn't want to embarrass you, but I have to ask, was that real?" The man looked up. There was a warmth in his eyes that had been quiet this whole time, tucked back behind the stillness. He said, "The food's getting cold." Patty laughed, a little startled, and walked away, and the man went back to his paper. Steven Seagal, who had spent a lifetime learning that real strength has nothing to prove and nowhere to show off, ate his eggs while the Silver Spoon Diner slowly found its rhythm again around him. What happened to the 5 teens? They made it to the parking lot before the silence between them became unbearable. Bryce sat on the hood of the car, rubbing his wrist where the man had held it, not because it hurt, but because he couldn't stop thinking about it, about how still the man had been, about how not once had he looked scared or angry or even all that interested, just certain, like the outcome was already decided, and the only question was how long it would take the other people in the room to figure it out. Nobody said much on the drive home. By nightfall, 3 different people in the diner had posted about it. By morning, it had spread to every parent, teacher, and coach in the school district. Video was grainy but clear enough. The soup, Harold, the shoving, the 4 seconds that followed. Bryce's father, who did in fact own significant real estate in the county, watched the clip at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He watched it twice. Then he put his phone down and called Bryce's name up the stairs, and his voice had a quality to it Bryce had not heard since he was 9 years old. The school principal met with all 5 families by Thursday. Their coach, a man named Coach Delaney, who had given 16 years to that athletic program and cared deeply about what it stood for, pulled them from the starting lineup for the remainder of the season. He didn't yell. He sat them down in the gym, on the bleachers, and told them, "I've been coaching for a long time. I have had kids go on to play college ball, go to the pros, do things that made me proud every day. And I have also seen talent get wasted by character, by thinking that being good at something means you don't have to be good to people. You want back on this court? You show me something different. Not on the floor, out there." The quiet kid with the glasses, whose name was Owen, went back to the Silver Spoon the following Saturday. He came alone, without the group, which took more courage than anything he had done all week. He asked Patty if Harold came in on Saturdays. She said yes, usually around 11. Owen said he'd like to come back then if that was all right. Patty looked at him for a long moment and said, "It's all right." He came back at 11. Harold was at his usual spot at the counter. Owen sat one stool over and introduced himself and apologized, simply and without excuses, the way that means something. Harold listened. Then Harold pointed at the menu and said, "The soup's good," and slid it over. And they sat there for a while in the particular quiet of 2 people who've decided to begin something better. Bryce took longer. That's the honest part of the story. Real change in people who've been told they're the center of everything doesn't happen in a week. But 3 months later, he was doing volunteer work at the senior center 2 towns over, organized by his father as part of an agreement with the school. He hated it for the first 2 weeks. Then, one afternoon, an old woman couldn't reach something on a shelf, and he reached it for her without thinking, just automatically, and she thanked him with such genuine warmth that something in him shifted quietly and without fanfare. He didn't become a different person overnight, but something cracked open, something that might, given time and effort and humility, become something worth being. Back at the Silver Spoon, Harold's soup bowl got replaced with a newer one that didn't wobble on the counter. Patty ordered it specifically. It was white with a thin blue rim. She didn't tell Harold about it, she just put it in front of him one Tuesday, and he looked at it, then looked at her, and she was already walking away. The corner booth with the cracked vinyl still sits at the back of the diner. Some of the regulars started calling it the quiet corner, not because anything dramatic lives there now, but because of what happened once, and who was sitting there, and how little noise it took to make everything right again. The man in the gray jacket never came back, or if he did, nobody saw him, which amounted to the same thing. But Patty kept a cup of black coffee on that table every morning until close, and when people asked why, she said it was just habit. But habit, if you think about it, is just the quiet way the heart keeps honoring the things it's not ready to let go of. Some people train their whole lives to be dangerous. The ones worth fearing are the ones who train their whole lives to be still.